Good morning. Thank you for joining us here at Hudson Institute, as well as those who are joining us virtually and streaming online. My name is Rebecca Heinrichs. I am a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute. I do a lot of commentary and research on a range of national security issues, but I do focus on missile defense, nuclear non-proliferation, and deterrence. And it is my great privilege to have with us today the ambassador, the Romanian ambassador to the United States, George Christian Maior. And what I'd like to do this morning is I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction. I'm not going to go over his entire bio because it's quite impressive and lengthy, but it is my intention to give a brief introduction and then let the ambassador speak, deliver some remarks, and then he and I will go on to have a conversation about the content of his remarks, and then I will turn it over to some questions from the audience, and we will have everybody on their way at 11:30. Ambassador Maior was accredited as Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Romania to the United States in June 2015 and officially commenced his mandate in September 2015. Previously, he was a diplomat in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs within the Department of Treaties and Department of Strategic Affairs from 1992 to 1997. Charge, you're going to challenge my Midwestern abilities here. Charge d'Affaires at the Romanian Embassy in Ireland from 1997 to 1999 and was conferred the rank of ambassador in 2004. From 2000 to 2004, he held the position of State Secretary and head of the Department for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Defense Policy within the Ministry of National Defense. In 2006, he was appointed Director of the Romanian Intelligence Service, overseeing an extensive reform process that allowed the SRI to strengthen bilateral and multilateral partnerships and gain a high level of public confidence. And what I've asked the ambassador to speak about today is the importance of the U.S.-Romanian alliance, and specifically not only the strategic alliance, but then the defense cooperation that we have with Romania, and then most specifically the missile defense cooperation that the United States has with Romania, as we do continue to have shared threats, and that relationship, regardless of U.S. administrations, that commitment to the alliance and our missile defense cooperation does in fact remain, as both administrations, the current one, the previous one, and the one before that, continue to call the alliance between the United States and our NATO allies, and specifically on missile defense, ironclad. And without further ado, Ambassador.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Heinrichs, for those remarks and your kind introduction. And first of all, I would like to express my gratitude to your institute, Hudson Institute, for its exceptional leadership on relevant matters of international security, for providing an engagement framework for debate and for generating so many ideas that become policy on a wide range of issues. And I would like to acknowledge also the leadership, of course, of Mr. Weinstein in this respect, and wish you success in those very interesting times for international security in generating such debates. Among other initiatives, let me highlight the Hudson Institute project dedicated to the security developments in the Black Sea region, which I will touch upon a bit in my remarks, and the need to keep the focus on this important, we believe, component of the Euro-Atlantic security. Furthermore, I'm much honored to refer, you mentioned that, in this setting, to the 20th anniversary, in fact, of the strategic partnership between United States and Romania. We celebrated that this year. A partnership founded on shared values of freedom and democracy, and a strong, really strong cooperation in security and defense. Well, in my remarks today, I would like to refer first to a more general subject, the overall threats to our security that we all share, and how we are working with the US to try to address them. Second, of course, allow me to point to what you already mentioned, the missile defense threat, and how the US-Romania missile defense cooperation developed in the last years. And third, I will try to underscore how this cooperation is meaningful to NATO development of missile defense capability. I would like, in this context, also to acknowledge the presence here of former ambassador, Romanian ambassador to US, Mr. Sorin Ducaru, Assistant Secretary General in NATO on emerging threats. It's a pleasure to see him here. Ladies and gentlemen, the security environment today, we believe, is marked by unpredictability. Over the past decade, we have witnessed overall, unfortunately, negative developments in international affairs from this point of view. On one hand, we see the rising impact of terrorism, especially from non-state actors like ISIS or other terror networks. Such networks, although countered, continue to seek new ways and places to develop and to employ capabilities that hold entire regions at risk. And this combined, of course, with cyber capabilities or ballistic missile capabilities, such actors can pose real threats way beyond their actual geographical location. On the other hand, Europe and the United States have been confronted with a different threat, resurgent Russia. We've seen Russia's assertive and aggressive conduct manifesting itself in the region and in many aspects of our societies. Of course, the 2014 annexation of Crimea was one of the most blatant examples in this respect, performed under the disguise of hybrid warfare tactics. But we can go in the past and mention Georgia 2008, Eastern Ukraine, of course, the influence of propaganda tactics, the use of cyber attacks in an attempt to interfere in some election processes. Also, what we see now, the military buildup in Crimea, speaking of the Black Sea, which is, by the way, only 150 miles from Romania's shores and then, of course, from NATO shores. The deployment of anti-access and area denial systems and other military assets in the Black Sea reflect an approach based on geopolitical competition. And this approach manifests itself, I must say, across the whole eastern flank of NATO, from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea. Such developments in the eastern part of NATO confirm the strategic importance of the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea regions for the whole Euro-Atlantic area, and reflect the need to consolidate NATO's deterrence and defense posture, of course. In this regard, the United States' commitment to European security is very, very important. Earlier this year, when President of Romania, Klaus Iohannis, met President Donald Trump, we have all witnessed the US President confirming the US commitment to collective defense and the protection of Europe, in fact, reconfirming that commitment. A similar strong message was presented last week by Secretary Tillerson at the NATO ministerial meeting. These firm political statements on deterrence and defense are backed, of course, by US contribution to European security, the presence of US forces, and the European Deterrence Initiative that we welcome. In this vein, I strongly believe that the transatlantic partnership remains the cornerstone of Euro-Atlantic security. This pillar is strengthened by deterrence and defense, but also through burden sharing among allies, in our opinion. And let me assure you that Romania takes this commitment seriously. We believe that, first of all, defense starts at home. For Romania, this includes reaching 2% of the GDP, and I would like to emphasize that this decision to allocate 2% of the GDP for defense was taken 3 years ago. It was a cross-party agreement to reach this level of spending, and it was based on a very serious and systematic assessment of the threat environment in the region that I've mentioned. And this is the first year when the 2% became operational in terms of the allocation for defense. I would like to mention also that last week on November 29, Romania signed an agreement with the US government to purchase the Patriot integrated air and missile defense system. This system is completely interoperable with NATO, of course, NATO capabilities, and will provide, we believe, a significant defense capability against air and missile threats, complementary effort to the US Aegis Ashore missile defense system hosted now by Romania. Also, Romania has recently completed acquisition and deployment of 12 US F-16 fighter jets, with clear prospects to purchase furthermore multi-role aircraft in the very near future. Other significant efforts are underway for a major modernization and procurement process, including investments in armored transporters, helicopters, multi-role corvettes, as well as the HIMARS system, high mobility artillery, for those that know the term. Let me turn now to my second point. Today, we continue to face major ballistic missile threats, widely acknowledged, of course. The attention this year was particularly focused, and still is focused, of course, on North Korea, with heated rhetoric and threats, with significant testing of vectors, with increased ranges that hold both United States and Europe at risk. Such actions breach UN Security Council resolutions and represent, of course, a grave threat to regional and international peace and security. On the other hand, also against UN Security Council resolutions, Iran has continued to develop a ballistic missile program and to aim for the increase of range and sophistication of its ballistic arsenal. Furthermore, there is a growing interest from non-state actors to acquire and use advanced missile technology, which poses also risks to our populations, forces, and territories. Once unpredictable actors acquire, of course, possess, or further develop this technology, it is easier to attempt to project force, to make threats, and to look for political gains and advantages using this capability. This demonstrates that the threat posed by the proliferation of ballistic missiles is real. It is not just a regional threat, but a global one that affects each and every one of us, and we need more missile defense, not less, in our opinion. Within this context, as a member of NATO and sharing a strategic partnership with the United States, Romania's decision to host the first Aegis Ashore of the US-European phase adaptive approach came as a natural contribution to the development of the NATO ballistic missile defense capability. Romania's participation in the missile defense has enjoyed strong political and public support. The ballistic missile defense agreement between US and Romania, negotiated between 2010 and 2011, was signed and ratified almost unanimously by the Romanian Parliament in 2011. The construction works at the Aegis Ashore broke ground in October 2013, and they were completed by the end of 2015. The joint statement of 18th of December 2015, which marked an important milestone in the development of the site, the joint statement US-Romania reads, and I quote, "Reaching today's achievement is indicative of the close cooperation between the United States and Romania, shared commitment to regional stability and security." The Aegis Ashore site was inaugurated on May 12, 2016, and transferred to NATO at the Alliance Warsaw Summit of last year. I believe that such example of missile defense cooperation as the one between US and Romania is very relevant today for any regional missile defense architecture. Also, having this missile defense asset adequately protected protection will reinforce the Allied capability on all accounts. This leads me to my third point and the final point, the importance of our missile defense cooperation for NATO as a whole. Last year, the Aegis Ashore was made operational and transferred, as I mentioned, to NATO. The Warsaw Summit which declared NATO BMD initial operational capability in the context of that summit. This is a practical result and a contribution to the overall Allied defense and deterrence. An important milestone will be reached also next year, as a second US Aegis Ashore in Poland is planned to become operational. Other allies make also, of course, important contributions. Germany hosts the Allied Command Center, Turkey hosts the US Early Warning Radar, Spain hosts 4 Aegis ships in Rota, Denmark and the Netherlands upgrade ships with radar capabilities. UK, of course, contributes with ground-based radars. As you can see, NATO ballistic missile defense is about burden sharing and about teamwork, and it's an effective response to the threat environment. As allies, we attach great importance to the development of the NATO BMD capability towards achieving full operational capability. This capability, combined with nuclear and conventional capabilities, has become part of NATO's overall strategy for credible deterrence and defense. Therefore, NATO BMD is a long-term investment against a long-term threat. It proves that NATO is adaptable to actual threats, demonstrates commitment of allies to share the burden for this important capability, and specifically reduces the risk to allies posed by ballistic missiles, both through deterrence and the protection it provides. The NATO missile defense capability, as well the Aegis Ashore missile defense facility, has been an entirely defensive endeavor, I must underline, developed in the spirit of cooperation and transparency. They do not, and I emphasize this, aim to undermine or weaken Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent. The small number of interceptors, the location of the sites in Romania as well as in Poland, makes it technically impossible to intercept Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles. The ballistic missile defense agreement, in fact, between US and Romania explicitly mentions that the system shall be used in full compliance with the UN Charter for legitimate self-defense and shall not possess offensive capabilities. The agreement also provides that the interceptors deployed in Romania are non-nuclear. They destroy a ballistic missile through the kinetic force of their impact and carry no explosive charge. These aspects have been made clear to Russia many times, and Russia was invited to cooperate on missile defense in the past, if you recall. Let us remember that Russia unilaterally terminated cooperation with NATO on missile defense in 2013. At the end, of course, the United States is in the process of updating its ballistic missile defense policy. We reflect how important missile defense cooperation is to address threats to our peace and security. In conclusion, the missile defense cooperation between US and Romania is indicative for a number of reasons. It highlights the strategic importance of a project that fits into a larger regional context and is valued to US, Romania, and the whole NATO. It contributes and demonstrates the US and allies' capacity to adapt to new and sophisticated challenges. It underscores the relevance of the burden sharing, solidarity, and indivisibility of security within NATO, and the solidity of the regional missile defense architecture, and of course, it consolidates the transatlantic link and overall collective defense of NATO. Thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Marvelous. What I'd like to do is, starting off, talk a little bit more about some of these shared threats, the European Phase Adaptive Approach, the EPAA, that the Obama administration initiated, is similar in some ways, many ways, to the previous administration, the Bush administration's. It's different systems, but the goals in many ways are the same. And that is to protect Europe, offer ballistic missile defense protection of Europe from missiles emanating from the Middle East in particular. That's what the sites are designed for. And we've done this in phases, and it has been on time, and we intend to keep that on time and on schedule with the delivery of the subsequent systems. Can you talk a little bit more about your country's understanding of that missile threat coming from the Middle East? Because we will often hear in the United States that many of our European allies do not share the same concern from the missile threat coming from the Middle East.
Yes, well, of course, we assess the threats from this perspective ourselves, but also together with allies. It is clear that I think in NATO we share a threat assessment with respect to the ballistic missile program that Iran continues to undertake. And that was a common assessment that was, I think, shared with some nuances by all allies. So we believe that we are in a unity mode in terms of understanding the threat emanating from the Middle East from this point of view in NATO.
Thank you. And to be clear, because regardless of any particular country's position on the JCPOA with Iran, that of course did not include restraints on its missile.
No, it didn't. So exactly. Yes.
Even if you take care of the one component, the nuclear program specifically, you still have a massive ballistic missile force that is continuing to grow and to be improved upon.
It's absolutely correct, and moreover, of course, we spoke about non-state actors. This is an issue that preoccupies allies and countries in NATO, and also from this perspective, we should be very careful in terms of covering spaces and territory in NATO that was not covered previously from this point of view. to counter a ballistic missile threat. So it fills a gap, in a way, in that region in NATO, and the gap will be further filled with the future development in Poland that I've mentioned.
Sure. And because of those shared intelligence assessments and recognition that the threat is real and exists, and there's no sign that it's going to decrease over time, it will increase as other countries develop ballistic missile capabilities, et cetera. There is a need for ballistic missile defense of Europe, and because of that particular threat. Now, you mentioned very eloquently the threats, though, that Russia has made against, in general, but specifically they have opposed the missile defense site. They've opposed the missile defense site. And can you talk a little bit, though, about why you mentioned that it isn't about Russia, that it is about the Middle East and threats emanating from that direction. But it has been my view that that if the United States and our NATO allies acquiesce and sort of back off some of these missile defense programs because of opposition from Russia, that's going to weaken the protection, of course, of Europe from the threats from the Middle East, and so it is not it's not a fair attack from Russia, verbal threats, et cetera, because we need this site because of these common threats.
I agree with, first of all, your evaluation and your commentary. I mentioned in my brief remarks that even in the agreement as such, we have specified that this is for self-defense. It's not an offensive capability. It's in line with the UN Charter, with the INF Treaty. We believe that it's a bad rhetoric to go on this path since you don't have the technical capabilities to be offensive with this system, and since you made all those reassurances in the treaty, and also NATO tried to convey this message that it's for the protection of our territory, filling a gap that is needed for protection from ballistic missiles threat from the Middle East. So this is where we stand. From time to time, we hear this rhetoric, and it's not based on reality. Yes.
And just to highlight a point that you just made, the Russians continue to accuse that Aegis Ashore site of violating the INF Treaty, which it in fact does not. Technically, it does not, and that is a broad consensus. Nobody really believes that it does. That's simply something that the Russians have accused. I would go a step further, though, too. You made remarks in your comments that missile defense, though, is only going to continue to expand. So it's not like once we have the EPAA complete that we're going to call it a day and be satisfied with that, because as the offensive threats continue to grow, then it's incumbent upon the alliances to make sure that we're staying ahead of the threat. We don't want to be constantly trailing the threat. We want to stay ahead of it. So we're going to expand missile defense. Missile defense is here to stay in Europe. It's here to stay in Asia, where the United States has great alliances and missile defense cooperation with our Asian allies as well. And simply because of the missile era that we've entered, it's going to have to be met with the missile defense era as well. There's going to be, you mentioned new missile defense cooperation, even beyond the initial Aegis Ashore site, that there will be other programs as well, and that's going to continue to develop. And if you'd like to add anything more on that point.
Yeah, well, of course, now the debate very intense. It's about the North Korean ballistic missile threat, and this only justifies the need for, first of all, reassessing always the threat environment, be ahead of the threat and further develop such systems regionally, because as things progress, even in Europe, in terms of its impact, the North Korean threat should preoccupy more allies and NATO in terms of our capabilities.
And just for our own edification, it would be good if you could talk to us a little bit about the political support or challenges or questions within your own country for U.S. missile defense deployments, because it certainly depends on the country, and there's different responses as the United States looks to increase missile defense cooperation from different countries.
Well, that's a very interesting question. There were debates in various countries, assertions that the deployment of missile defense on the territory of an ally will only increase a certain vulnerability for that country in terms of the attention it reflects internationally or from state or non-state actors in terms of the evolution of its defense policy. It was not the case in terms of the public perception in Romania. We have tested this particular element of our cooperation with U.S. in several polls conducted, and there is indication of strong support of the population, first of all, towards the operationalization of this project, and secondly, overall U.S.-Romanian strategic and defense cooperation is supported by the majority of the population, because they understand the nature of the threats, and not only the ballistic threat, but also I mentioned the region, the negative developments in the last decade, and the fact that you see geography, it's becoming more and more compressed even in the Black Sea. So for the first time with Crimea, we have, I will say, a sort of a maritime border now with Russia, which really changes a bit the strategic situation, a bit more the strategic situation in the Black Sea, which is so important.
I think that raises an important point that not only is this alliance merely a defense alliance or a strategic alliance, but it's a political alliance. And
absolutely,
so
yes.
The willingness of Romania to step up and in its willingness to host these sites demonstrates a certain degree of a political commitment to the United States and our mission there, into the NATO alliance, into the overall security of Europe.
And I mentioned also the increased allocation for defense, 2%. This figure, 2%, was discussed years ago in Romania, even before it became so relevant in terms of a discussion in NATO or even, of course, here in US. And this is also on the basis of our own evaluation of the security environment and our own belief that, as I mentioned, always defense starts home. And we want to pursue a very ambitious program of modernization of our military. I mentioned that in my remarks. It's a 10-year program that we have in mind, which covers lots of areas, air defense, of course, I've mentioned, but also maritime capabilities, other capabilities. And I think this also is important for the collective defense of NATO and for what we're trying to do now to, let's say, reassure through a posture of serious deterrence the eastern flank of NATO, which is so much, we believe, not only Romania, but also other allies like Poland, the Baltic states, of course, very exposed to an unpredictable security environment right now.
And once again, because my view of the administrations of the U.S. administration's emphasis of our allies reaching that 2% is not merely because of the money contribution, which is important, but it is indicative of the overall commitment. And as you mentioned, there are other ways to demonstrate a commitment and for burden sharing as well, and certainly a willingness to host the Aegis Ashore site is surely a demonstration of will and commitment and political commitment.
And I wanted to mention also that the fact that from this allocation of 2% to defense, 40% is going in acquisitions and modernization programs. That I think that's very relevant for our intentions. Yeah.
And then one more specifically on the missile defense program. Can you provide a little bit of insight in terms of the overall confidence that your country has in the reliability of the systems that are going to be deployed? And because, there's this in the United States, when we argue amongst ourselves about some of these systems, there are those who say that the systems aren't as reliable as we would want them to be, to which I say that's very interesting because our allies certainly want them and are buying them or are hosting them or are investing in them as well.
Yeah, well, of course, technology always evolves. It only evolves, and we are trying to make our own assessments of what we are embarking upon. We have serious discussions on those aspects, and of course, we want the best, and the fact that some of those systems were tested successfully only reassures us that we are doing the right thing.
Certainly, and then missile defense systems they don't ever have to be 100%. They're there to provide protection, and they're important for the offense-defense mix.
Exactly.
For each country. And if you could talk a little bit then, and then I'm going to turn it over to the floor, so if you all could be prepared to be thinking about questions. And that is this idea of, you talked a little bit about burden sharing in general, and your already commitment to that 2%, but Romania has also contributed burden sharing in other military operations with the United States as well. So there's some history there. If you want to talk a little bit about that, and then I'm going to turn it over to the floor so you can be prepared.
Yeah, well, I mentioned in my bio, for 4 years I was Deputy Minister for Defense. It was a very complicated period with Afghanistan, of course, and since 2003, I think we've rotated more than 30,000 military in Afghanistan, Romania. We are the 4th contributor right now with forces in Afghanistan. Again, this is indicative of what we understand in terms of alliances and border sharing. Also, strong presence in the Balkans at certain points. Also, I will mention the special cooperation that we have, and I think this is of paramount importance in terms of always assessing this dynamic threat environment, the cooperation in the field of intelligence services among our agencies and countries. So all those added, I think, really make for a strong partnership in this respect, and burden sharing really understood in substance, not only rhetorical.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that that we do have our allies constantly fighting alongside us in the long war against Islamic radicalism. With that, if there is a question or two from the audience.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Svedia. I'm from the Czech Embassy, Czech Republic's embassy. I have a kind of controversial question, but I hope you will answer it anyway. Actually, for both of you. So you rightly said, Mr. Ambassador, that the current missile defense system is not aimed at the Russian missile threat because it's technically impossible to do that. But in a more or less distant future, when and if it becomes technically possible and financially affordable, do you think it would be advisable for NATO to develop such a system that would be able to address the Russian strategic forces threat? Thank you.
That's an hypothetical question. Now, clearly, we're focusing on the threats I've mentioned emanating from the Middle East. Of course, it's hard to predict evolutions in terms of the strategic developments in the region and internationally. We'll always be prepared to make assessments of the threat of the medium and the long term and take the necessary decisions in case the threat increases, or it might diminish, of course.
Of course, my position is not the position of the U.S. government, but the U.S. government is free to adopt it. And my answer to that is our allies and the United States should defend themselves from threats that they perceive. No country is entitled to threaten free and sovereign nations. And so, you know, while I appreciate the arguments that the United States and allies continue to make to sort of prove that the system will not demean or lessen the offensive force that Russia has, if it were up to me, I wish that we would stop trying to convince them of that, mainly because I think that it concedes to some degree the argument that it's entitled to have an offensive force that does credibly threaten our allies in the United States of America. So right now, we're building defenses against the threats that we perceive emanating out of the Middle East. But as technology improves and as the offensive threats continue to grow, the United States and our allies should build defenses to the best of our abilities against any threat that we perceive.
Frederick Peterson, Marine Corps Colonel, retired, but now Congressional Defense Advisor. I'm interested in, and I've been to Romania many times and consider them very, very close friends and very valued allies. They occupy very critical terrain, and you certainly are on the front lines. There is an evolving challenge, however, that we're touching around here, and that is the changing nature of the threat. We have a new Russian-Iranian alliance, both of which create very serious challenges to the security of NATO and the stability of the region. And this addresses very directly the strategic concerns that you have laid out and the importance of Romania in our alliance and the amount of resources that you're contributing to it. What can the United States do to improve that relationship with Romania and your neighbors? You got Serbia, Hungary, all, Poland certainly. What can we do to improve that relationship, and what does Romania see in the near and not too distant future as to how this may develop? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments and the appreciation of our cooperation. I believe that indeed the region degraded in terms of its overall security with those events I've mentioned, Ukraine, Crimea. I didn't speak a lot about the whole range of frozen conflicts that are bordering, in fact, the eastern flank of NATO, Transnistria, Moldova, Abkhazia, Georgia, was only add to the complexity of the security environment. We were very fast in trying to have a conversation with the new administration on those aspects, and I've mentioned briefly in my remarks a visit of our president and the discussions we had with President Trump. We highlighted those concerns that we have with respect to the region and trying to find new ways of further developing our cooperation in terms of security and defense. And this visit was followed very soon by a visit of our Minister for Defense that discussed in concrete terms aspects of our cooperation, which will only increase in the coming years in terms of defense and security, including the need, for example, to further develop our cooperation at the Black Sea in terms of the Kogalniceanu base, which is used now for the rotation. This is a base at the Black Sea, which is used for the rotation of troops to Afghanistan. I think this is an important element that can be considered. Also, the European Deterrence Initiative is very relevant. It's a U.S. commitment to the region, and it's going on very well in terms of U.S. presence on the entire eastern flank. I think this should continue, and Congress should support for the future this initiative. I believe that the B9 format, so-called B9 countries from Central and Eastern Europe, the Bucharest format, allies from NATO discussing those issues as highlighting, emphasizing the situation, the security situation on the eastern flank in the spirit of solidarity. It's very important as an initiative that we have. We also have this new scheme of cooperation. President Trump attended a meeting in Poland of the so-called Three Seas initiative, the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Sea. Next year, Romania is hosting this initiative, and we hope that America will and be involved again in those discussions that have, of course, a strategic dimension, but also an economic dimension, because we didn't speak a lot about this, but energy security, other aspects are also important for the overall stability. So there are many things in motion, and we only hope that cooperation bilaterally and, of course, multilaterally will increase among allies in this respect.
Thank you for your service as well. And I would just add that, as the United States just continues to pursue these close relationships, that one of the best things that the United States government can do is to pursue them, regardless of the opposition that there's going to be from other regional actors as Russia continues to oppose them. And so, as we just sort of stick with it and stick with the plan, these energy partnerships, missile defense expansion, I believe it was a mistake in the past for the United States government to, even though the commitment was always there to protect Europe, the previous administration backed off a previous missile defense plan because of the opposition coming from Russia, in part, and that was the Czech radar and the 10 ground-based interceptors in Poland, and then the the missile defense plan was changed to the current one we have now with Aegis Ashore and Patriot and THAAD and other missile defense systems that are going to continue to expand. So just from just one of the best things we can do is to stick with these partnerships and plans. And when we say we're going to do them, follow through on those commitments and make sure they're on time and on schedule, regardless of opposition, because there will be opposition. That's inevitable, I think. I think we have time for one last question before we close out for the morning. And if there isn't any more, then please join me in thanking the ambassador for his time and for his remarks.